going to be talking about facilities and administrative, or F&A, aka indirect costs. So, Doug, I turn it over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our session here today. My name's Doug Leavell. I'm the Director of Research Analytics here at CSU in the VPR's office. Prior to that, I was Director of Sponsored Programs, both here at CSU and at St. Louis U and Washington University. And both of those places, I was responsible for the negotiation of the indirect cost rates and the fringe benefit rates. So I've done this a couple of times, and I'm a cost accountant, being counter by training. So stop me if I go too long on all this stuff. So if you have questions, feel free to stick your hand up in the air, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. Just kind of do an outline here, and then we can do some discussion stuff. So first slide here, I just kind of wanted to talk about the long history of cost reimbursement and indirect cost reimbursement with the federal government for research and support of the research infrastructure. Prior to World War II, there was not a lot of research going on that was sponsored by the federal government, right? And so it was usually kind of just a direct cost reimbursement, usually just paid for the salaries of the researchers working on the project, that kind of thing. And then World War II hit, and the Manhattan Project and science and technology and research sponsored by the federal government got a boost from the Office of Scientific Research and Development. So that was going on, and there was not the same sort of reimbursement process that we have now, where there's a rate or whatever. That they actually the universities would send them a bill, research organizations would send them a bill, and they would pay them all sort of as direct expenses. And then between the 40s and the 80s, we started to get more sophistication involved in the process. So there was the Higher Ed Act of 65, the OMB circulars start to come out, the cost principles, A21, and the other cost principles for the other kinds of organizations, state and local governments, Indian tribal organizations, hospitals, Medicare reimbursement gets kind of lumped in there. And the idea of there being cognizant agencies, the HHS, Division of Cost Allocation, and the ONR. And so the process started to get more formal, although not less complicated, confusing, and unnecessarily hard, I guess you would say. And then in the 80s, there were some audits that uncovered some problems. Our friends at Stanford had some yachts in their indirect cost pools and those kinds of things. Even at WashU, we got caught once. The auditors were looking for things, and the Chancellor Danforth was funding the creation of a statue of bears. So the mascot was the Bears, and he wanted a statue of the Bears to honor a retiring football coach. And so he thought he was just hiding the expense from the coach, so the coach wouldn't see it, so he would be surprised at his retirement. But it ended up in an indirect cost pool, and we had to barefaced or red-faced, we had to take those out. So there were some controversy that brought in some stricter controls, and the cost accounting standards got applied to colleges and universities. Those had previously only been applied in the defense industry to defense contractors. So more formal definitions about what is an indirect cost, what can be allocated, how it can be allocated, what's allowable, what's unallowable. Our friendly neighborhood capped administrative rate comes along in this time period, where they capped the admin rates at 26%, regardless of what you could demonstrate that you had in terms of administrative costs. They were capped. And then we get into the present day, where the uniform guidance comes along, where they try to streamline the process, standardize the process a little more with replacing the circulars A110 and A21 and all those 87 in 2 CFR 200. Lots of pressure always by Congress to simplify the process, cut the process. Those costs are not real costs. Universities are putting profit on their stuff, which we'll demonstrate later on is far from the truth. And then the new administration, the newest problem is just this idea of a unilateral rate reduction to 15%. Like we're gonna throw out all of the rules and regulations and the administrative processes. We're just going to say we're going to give you a rate of 15%. So that's kind of how we got here today. There's been a long relationship with the federal government, complicated relationship on the reimbursement of indirect costs, facilities and admin costs. So what are these costs? So this is a graphic I poached from our friends at Koger as a demonstration or an infographic, which kind of tries to visualize the difference between direct costs and indirect costs. So on the left-hand side in the bubble, there's a representation of all the things that are direct costs, right? Those are easily identifiable to a project and benefit the project directly. So things like salaries of researchers, pieces of equipment, the lab supplies that get consumed as part of the experiments, the reimbursement for graduate students, those kinds of things, easily identifiable to the project, are considered direct expenses. But those aren't the only expenses necessary, right, in order to have a research infrastructure and be able to conduct good research. So on the right-hand side, you see the depiction of a building. And so these are the kinds of things that end up in pools that we'll talk about and get reimbursed through the facilities administration costs. These are the facilities kinds of costs. So depreciation of the building, the utilities, lights, water, all the power, all the things that go into the lab that make the lab a space where we can conduct research. All of the general administrative costs of the university, a fair share of that gets allocated. So people that create paychecks for students and researchers and faculty members and negotiate fringe benefits and do the kinds of things that to comply with all the rules and regulations, the human subject stuff, the animal subject stuff, all of that gets involved in what gets reimbursed through the facilities and administrative cost. Even the cost of the library gets allocated to the functions of the university. And all of those are reimbursements for costs. They're not taxes, they're not made up. They're actual expenses that contribute to the infrastructure that make it so we can conduct research and do those kinds of things.
Let's run this other poll here.
Okay, thanks, Shannon.
Let's see what people think. What best describes facilities and administrative cost? Okay, there we go. We've got 31 responses. Oh, everyone's being really good. Anyone want to put something in one of the other two? I was almost going to say too complicated, just so that we could have a little bit different. Okay, we've got.
It's definitely
okay, there we go.
Complicated.
I think I bullied a couple people into putting too complicated in there. And I don't think that, Doug, I don't think that you would disagree that it is too complicated sometimes, right?
It is too complicated, and we should have some more good faith conversations with our friends at the federal government level to make sure that we are being reimbursed appropriately for the infrastructure necessary to conduct research and to comply with all of their rules and administrative regulations and all those things. I think, sometimes, and particularly lately with the new administration, we get caught in the and I faced this sometimes when we were negotiating with the federal government. They'd say, well, nonprofits, hey, the Gates Foundation, they only give you 10%. Why does the federal government have to pay the larger rate or the higher rate? Those kinds of arguments happen. So what kinds of things? What kinds of here are the pools or the cost categories that go into the facilities and the administrative costs. In the facilities side, these are the big pools of costs that are identified in 2 CFR 200. building depreciation, the interest that the university incurs in borrowing costs to build research facilities, operations and maintenance. So that's all the facilities cost, the cost of repairing things, the cost of keeping things clean and safe, and the cost of utilities goes into O&M, those kinds of things. Equipment that we use in research, the fair shares of that go into the depreciation equipment that's acquired, and the cost of the library gets allocated, and we'll see how that process works. On the administrative side, there's the general and administrative costs. So that's the cost of the president's office, the cost of the CFO's office, for instance, insurance, all those kinds of the deans, all those kinds of general administration for the university gets allocated to functions of the university and gets to be part of the indirect cost rate. College and department administrators. So we have quite a few college and department administrators here. Your costs are included in the admin category in order to conduct research and again to file financial reports and do all the kinds of things. And there's also a pool for sponsored projects administration. So the cost of being able to create proposals, submit proposals, comply with cost accounting standards, do animal care appropriately, human subjects, all that kind of stuff ends up in the sponsored projects administration.
Doug, we had one more poll. I'm gonna launch it just to see what people are thinking.
Okay.
Looking to see if people know. So what F&A cost pool does your job exist? What do you think? Okay, we're getting some responses here. And this might be a complicated question for someone like, let's say, our faculty out there.
In general, faculty are going to be direct costs to research projects, but if you're a department chair, some of your expense gets allocated to the college and departmental administration, so you're part of the administrative process as well. And speaking of complexities, that there's a real complexity in determining how much of your effort as a departmental administrator, as a college administrator, how much of it ends up in the pool, and how much of it is in a different pool, or how much of it might be considered as a direct cost to a project.
Yeah, and Doug, when we're going through and doing, the space studies and the special studies, is that something that they are trying to determine at that time for that administrative side of it, or no?
Only for the space that the administrators occupy. So there's allocations and cross allocations of costs. And so if you occupy space, your space costs would get allocated to the indirect cost pool. Again, another sort of complicated process of allocation and cross allocation. And there's a thing called the direct charge, the DCE, the direct charge equivalent, that they go through and try and figure out, you're overcharging me. The Fed's position is you're overcharging me for college and department administration. Although at some point it doesn't matter, right? Because that pool is capped at 26%. So the goal of the university in that situation is to make sure that when you calculate your administrative portion of your rate, that you're safely over 26%. And that means they don't have a lot of incentive. The federal investigator or the federal negotiators don't have a lot of incentive to poke around on and spend a lot of time auditing that piece of it because it's already capped at 26.
Is there any, I'm sorry, I'm asking too many questions.
No, go ahead.
And everyone, if you have questions about this, ask, but is there any thought process during this next negotiation and in our base year that potentially we would ever be underneath the 26%?
The last time I talked to Jackie, we were pretty close. And in fact, for other sponsored activities, one of the other pools, the last time we negotiated, we did slip under that 26% rate.
Yeah, we did.
And that one comes into play for your off-campus research activities as well. So that's the rate we get to charge for off-campus. But yeah, whatever we do, we don't want to slip under 26 for the organized research stuff as best we can.
Thank
And
you.
it goes to, right, everybody here will understand, sort of the CSU way of we're proud of doing very much with very little. And so sometimes that catches up with us, right? In terms of, hey, at the department or at the administrative level, you're doing lots of different jobs, right? You're doing lots of work. And I know when I was director of sponsored programs, I would go to COGR meetings, or I would go to meetings, and they would say, well, what's your volume? And you would tell them, hey, we're doing $400 or $500 million of expenses every year. And how many people do you have in sponsored programs? And they would always ask that question kind of twice, because we were always on the very low side of staffing and headcount and things, for based on the volume that we do and the kind of complexity that we have. And then just some more specific examples of the kinds of things that end up in those pools. On the left-hand side, you see examples of G&A that we talked about. So information systems, business and financial services, academic computing, human resources, procurement, all those kinds of things are in the general G&A cost of the university. O&M costs, you got custodial costs, hazardous waste, and biosafety, which are important things that we have, utilities, insurance, facilities, work orders, all those kinds of things go into the O&M pool. How does a proposal get put together? These are the kinds of steps that we do. So we create a proposal to our cognizant agency, which right now is the Health and Human Services Division of Cost Allocation. We negotiate a predetermined rate. So what we try to do is we'll have a base year where we collect all the information for that base year. And we are currently in a base year. Jackie in business and finance is working on that right now. We'll have a base year. We'll present all the actual results to the federal negotiators, and then we'll begin the negotiation process. So the process for doing that, the steps that have to take place, is there's a space survey and any kind of special studies that get done. So we want to make sure that we understand what our space is being used for, because that, as you'll see as we go forward, is a very important thing to know to get the cost allocated to the proper functions. So research and instruction, that kind of thing. Then we'll load once the financial year is over and we get the audit done and we have final financial statements, we'll load all the financial information system into the comprehensive rate information system, which is a piece of software that colleges and universities use to create a proposal. And then Jackie and her team will begin the transaction review. So we'll scrub all the transactions and make sure there aren't any bear statues or yachts or unallowable things in those cost pools that we are using. And then we'll create some projections about buildings and things that will come online, big projects that will happen during the course of the next rate period. So we'll try to negotiate 3 or 4 years worth of predetermined rates, and we'll try to get included in that negotiation process buildings that are going to come online. So we drop those projections in there, and then we negotiate, which is part of the complexity of the process, in that you create these proposals using their rules, using your actual financial information. You create a rate, and then it's subject to, hey, well, I can only, as a federal negotiator, I'm not going to let you be the highest university in my geographical area, for instance. Or you may calculate that the F&A rate's going to go up by 5 points, but they're not, they'll never give you a 5-point increase. Maybe it'll only be 2. So we go through, which is why the system is complex. We go through a lot of work to create the F&A proposal and get to the negotiation, and then it's subject to some sort of sometimes arbitrary negotiation tactics by the feds. Here is kind of a complicated, speaking of complications, a complicated graphic of how the indirect cost gets calculated. So on the far left-hand side, you'll see here are all the F&A costs, and these are the costs that we get from the financial statements. And so we break them down into the 2 different big pools, facilities and administrative costs. And then we allocate them to the functions of the university. So when we say we calculate an indirect cost rate, we're actually calculating 4 indirect cost rates. There's a organized research rate, which is a function of the university that's recognized in 2 CFR 200. There's instruction for sponsored instruction and the support of instruction. There's other sponsored activities, things like what SEML does most often falls into other sponsored activities, those kinds of things. And then there's other institutional activities, which is where we put all the unallowable expenses and sort of everything else. You can see that for facilities and an uncapped pool, we allocate those costs to the functions that end up in the rate by space, which is why the space survey is so important, that we make sure that if a space in a building is being used to do organized research, then it gets coded as organized research so that the cost of that space, the building depreciation, um, the utilities, all those things get allocated and put in the proper rate, because the organized research rate is the rate we're sort of most interested in, because that's the one that is used on the bulk of the projects that we have and returns the most cost reimbursement back to the university. So we say, hey, we're going to allocate via space, we'll get it into those functions, and then we calculate a rate of the indirect costs that are in the pool is the numerator of the rate, and the modified total direct cost. So the total direct cost is in the bottom of the fraction. So modified total direct cost excludes equipment and some other things. It's a quiz. I haven't done this in a while. So equipment, the cost of, and correct me where I go wrong, Shannon, the cost of sub-recipients over $25,000, student aid, scholarships and fellowships. What else is not in MTDC? Oh, I'm embarrassed now.
No, you're good. Anyone else want to pipe in? And we need to also mention that that the definition of MTDC is written into our indirect cost agreement. So while uniform guidance has changed their thresholds for both equipment and for sub-recipients, because that definition is written into our indirect cost rate agreement, we have not been able to change our thresholds for sponsored projects yet. So currently we're at still the old rates, so 5,000 for equipment and 25,000 for sub-recipients, even though uniform guidance has changed those thresholds to 10 and 50,000. So, but yes, Lisa has put in there participant support and Sarah has put rent.
So MTDC is designed to prevent sort of over allocation of indirect costs to projects. Like if I bought a big piece, if we were just doing total direct costs and I bought a big piece of equipment on my project, I would get sort of unfairly allocated a larger share of indirect cost because of the cost of that piece of equipment. So that's why they pull out equipment and they pull out, although I've never really understood the logic behind the subrecipient exclusion from MTDC. It doesn't cost any less to administer that subcontract because it's larger and often probably incurs more cost to administer something that's a larger cost and more complex. But that's the sort of cost accounting theory behind taking some of those things out of MTDC, which is to sort of prevent a misallocation or an unfair allocation of indirect expenses. And there is some language in there that they can adjust things on a project by project basis too, in order to avoid an unfair allocation of indirect costs. And so the library is a weird one because they allocate that based on head count, so student head count, faculty head count, that kind of thing, rather than a space allocation. The administrative expenses get allocated to the pools based on MTDC. Student services, also a head count, a student head count kind of thing to allocate those costs to those pools. And then there's some cross allocations of things. So some space costs end up into administrative pools to reflect the idea that, administrators, we occupy space. So that should be part of the cap or in the capped pool. And that's what the software does for us is it, we tell it the rules and the software then takes all our expenses and puts them into those proper categories and does a step down schedule and does all that calculation that a million years ago we had to do by hand with a big Fox Pro database to show you how old I am.
I have a question. So
Sure.
you mentioned that we have software that does this for us now. Um, do we ever hire consultants to help with this process at all?
We do. So Huron, one of the big players, kind of helps us do those kinds of things. It's important to, sort of have the consultants there because they have experience with sort of where you can be, where you have to be conservative, where you should be conservative, and where you can be a little more aggressive in terms of how you're coding space or how you're treating certain expenses. So there's always expenses, categories of expense that you can be a little more aggressive, including in the pool, or you can be a little more conservative about, well, we'll just go ahead and take it out and cost yourself something on the rate in terms of that. And that's sort of the general advice now. I've listened to some webinars because of the whole focus on the unilateral reduction of indirect cost. Sort of focus now is to make sure that your proposals that you submit are very, very what we'd say tight or very, very accurate. That you go to great pains to make sure that you're not being overly aggressive in any areas. It's going to be more and more difficult because as of recently, they've really the federal government has really gutted the DCA. They've closed a couple of the regional offices. They've pushed everything back to the DC offices and laid off sort of half the negotiators, I think, in terms of people being able to respond to proposals and I think our advice from the consultants this time around is to ask for an extension, submit the proposal and ask for an extension of the current 54% rate. And so that's one sort of way to approach what's going on right now.
Great, thank you. I guess my question to everybody is, did you know that it was this convoluted, what we have to go through in order to negotiate our indirect cost rate? I mean, just in chat, yes, no, or you can always do reactions.
So other consultants that we had sort of back in the day, we would do a library study. So we would hire somebody to come in and help us be aggressive and uh, get more out of the library piece of the cost because it's in an uncapped pool, right? So it was worth paying somebody to help us come in and make sure that we were allocating the library to organize research in an effective manner. We used to do utility studies, so you could hire engineers to come in under the idea that research space makes sense, right? Common sense. Research space uses a greater percentage of utilities than instruction space. So like a wet lab obviously uses more electricity and water and those kinds of things than a classroom space. Yeah, definitely, Bill. Library costs are more expensive than you would realize, and it's in an uncapped pool. So to the extent that we can get that in there, but we used to do the utility study, so much so that we forced a utility cost adjustment as a way to sort of make that process less complicated and less expensive. So the government recognized that, hey, yeah, they did a study of the top 25 or 50 research universities and determined, I think, and this is off the top of my head, and it's been years since I've done it, so don't hold me to it. I think the utility cost adjustment's like 3 something or 2.5 or something. They did a study and said, yeah, well, we do recognize that research space does consume utilities at a greater cost. So instead of us paying for folks to come in and do that study, we just get to use an adjustment. We just take our utility cost and use that factor to push more into the organized research pool. At WashU, we would hire people to come in and look at the space and make sure that the space study, the instructions were right. They would walk the space. I had a full-time civil engineer on staff who kept track of, he constantly had blueprints on his desk, keep track of all the construction and improvements to research space to make sure that we got those into the calculation appropriately. So there are lots of ancillary expenses, sort of a full employment act for consultants, accountants, and lawyers to help us get the most out of the indirect cost proposal, because these are real costs and they're expensive costs, and we want to make sure we're getting reimbursed for them.
Okay, we have a poll right now. Why is the space survey important? And while people are doing the poll, I'm also interested. How many of you are currently in the audience? And it can be a show of hands, whatever. Is anyone currently involved in our current space survey? I have a hand. I have 2, 3, 4. Yes.
So the space survey is a big undertaking for both the people responding to it and then the people creating it. So Jackie's team that has to create it, because the instructions, believe it or not, the instructions that you include with the space survey are part of the negotiation. So the negotiators will look at the space survey and the instructions that you send out to make sure that you're not sort of leading people to the answer that you want them to have, but make sure that the instructions are fair and impartial, and that folks are really seriously looking at the space and how is that space used. As part of the negotiation, the negotiators will show up, and I've taken negotiators around and we look at space, and we walk around in wet labs, and I had one negotiator would look around for backpacks and tennis rackets and stuff sitting in the corner of a wet lab and say, wait a minute, there's students in here, and so that means this can't be 100% organized research space. We're like, yeah, students here do lots of the work, right? Graduate students do lots of the work of research and to get research done, and the space is definitely organized research. They're working on organized research projects. They may be learning how to do research, but they're actually working on yeah, I bring a backpack too. So, but this guy would try to reduce the amount of organized research space based on sort of these things that he saw. Notwithstanding that, we never had enough space, right? Because in the hallways are full of freezers and pieces of equipment and things that don't fit in the lab, but are necessary. And that hallway is circulating space. And so it's not allocated to organized research at all, even though it's being used for organized research, right? Because we have to store those things out there, because we need to use the wet lab space more productively than to have a freezer sitting in there. If we can move it out in the hallway and have another bench there, so we can have another student with a place to put their backpack. So it gets relatively complicated, because the research or the negotiator's job is to make sure that the rate is low, and our job is to make sure that we're getting fairly reimbursed. So they'll look at space, they'll look at pieces of equipment, how they're being used, those kinds of things. Make sure they'll have a list that pieces of equipment, and we'll take a list out of the records, and then go and try and find those pieces of equipment and look at the space that they're in, and make sure that the equipment depreciation is being allocated appropriately, and that our records are correct, right? So that's why inventories and tagging and all those kinds of things that seem like really administrative tasks and are kind of like, why am I doing this? It's because we need to keep track of that stuff, because there's a real implication for the indirect cost calculation. I think there was a question there.
Yep, there's a question from Bill. It says, how do we treat spaces that are used for both sponsored research, 5.3 accounts, and service, 2.2 accounts, when they work in the same space survey, when it's the same cost to maintain the space for both of those activities?
It'll be a percentage basis. So if there's 100 square feet in there, and you'll have to make some kind of calculation of 75% of that is being used for organized research, a 5.3 project, and other of it's being used for service or another sponsored activity or another institutional activity if it's an unallowable kind of thing. So they'll say 75 square feet of that is organized research, and 25 square feet of it is other sponsored activity. So there's some calculation that gets made, right? It doesn't have to be it'll be audited, but it doesn't have to be, well, when I do my 2.2 work, I stand over in this corner and do it over here. You just try to be fair in your allocation of the functions that go on in there, because I mean sometimes there is instruction that happens in a wet lab, right? So people come in as part of a class and they are really learning and not really working on a project, but they spend some time in the lab, and so maybe some of that space gets allocated to instruction to reflect that idea.
Doug, I have a question. I apologize, y'all, I'm monopolizing questions, but do the negotiators always come in person? Or is most of this generally done behind the scenes and, email, phone call type situation?
At the bigger universities that they do try and show up. I haven't done it in a while, and I know COVID changed things a little bit when people couldn't travel, and the technology of doing things over the phone and using Teams meetings, whatever. I'm sure that some of the smaller institutions can get things done. I moonlighted a little bit negotiating rates for places, and just would do it all on the phone even before all this. You could just do it via email and documents and those kinds of things. It kind of depends on the stakes, right? I mean, I'm sure people are showing up at MIT and Harvard, and I think our negotiators show up here actually and look at space, and so I think it's important for them to see the space and feel the space and see the big buildings and those kinds of things.
And Bill asked again, what if both kinds of work, and I assume, Bill, you're talking about the 5-3 and the 2-2 work, take 100% of the space, same space slash equipment. It's just the time it is used to split between the two, used 40% for sponsored activities, 60% for the time on the 2-2 work.
Yeah, you kind of got to make a way to, it's almost like a proportional benefit kind of calculation, if you're familiar with that on a direct expense, is that, yeah, of all the work that goes through this space, 75% of it is organized research and 25% of it is, excuse me, is for the 2-2 account. You just have to have logic that would pass muster if somebody asked the question, well, how did you arrive at that? How did you arrive at that calculation? How did you arrive at that split for the space in this room or in these suite of rooms? If you can make a logical argument there, you can defend your decision. If you say, I don't know, I just said 10%, they're probably going to challenge that, or right. I mean, and I've had negotiators just say, you know what, I know your space system is rigged, or your space survey is rigged to your benefit, and so I'm just going to knock 10% off of how you've allocated it. I'm going to move 10% of the space out of organized research, and I'm going to put it into other institutional activities as unallowable. Or I know that you're not capturing cost share appropriately. I see you have some documentation, but I know that documentation of cost share is always weak, and so I'm just going to add some dollars to your modified total direct cost base, right? If the base is bigger, holding the top of the fraction equal, if the base gets bigger, the rate goes down, right? So it's in their interest to make sure that the MTDC is as large as possible and at the top as small as possible. So the pool's costs are smaller. So I've had them, which sort of adds to that complexity and that idea of, hey, well, wait a minute, we followed all your rules and we did all this and we have all this documentation, and then your approach is going to be, yeah, I know it's wrong. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to add something there to reflect that you don't do a good job of keeping track of cost share, for instance, or your space system is not adequate, or the decisions that folks are making were made. The instructions to the space survey weren't neutral enough, maybe. So those are the kinds of things we would certainly have to go through as we sit in a room and try to negotiate with federal folks. We turn over all the stuff, and then they come back and say, well, no, I don't think that's right. And then we say, yeah, it is. Here's the accounting records. And they're like, but your accounting system is weak. Or let me look at your A133 audit and see I don't know, they don't call it A133 audit, your single audit now. Let me look at your single audit and see what findings are there, so that I can question your internal control environment, for instance, and the accuracy of your accounting records, and to make sure that those things are all there. So the last base year that we had was fiscal year 2018, and Jackie was kind enough to share with me the proposal itself and the step down schedules, and And so I took all the costs that ended up in those pools that calculated the rate, just to kind of give you a feel for um, what makes up the rate and where the big cost drivers are. So you can see that on the admin side, the college and department administration is by far the biggest chunk of admin, and so it's imperative that we get that correct, and then G&A, and then OSP. O&M is the biggest chunk of the uncapped pool. So that's why that space survey is so important to get those costs allocated to organized research appropriately. Building depreciation, equipment depreciation, interest, and then the library, because the library really gets watered down because of the student population. Because I know when I was a student, I spent a lot of time in the library. As opposed to graduate students and researchers and the cost of all those expensive Elsevier things that we have. And this is just another sort of visualization of by a percentage basis as opposed to a dollar basis of what makes up the rate, the negotiated 54% rate. So again, the biggest part is facilities, and the biggest part of facilities is O&M. Admin, the biggest part of admin is department and college administration. So just to kind of for an interesting comparison, so the organized research rate that we calculated based on our financial records and our space survey and all the things that go into creating that proposal, we calculated a 60.3% rate. What we negotiated were the green bars, 52, 52, 52, 53, 53 and a half, and 54. So you can see that, notwithstanding the cap, right? Because something's capped, that means we artificially start off in the hole of what we collect. And then the negotiation process takes another big chunk out of what our actual reimbursement rate should be versus what the predetermined rate ends up being as a product of that negotiation process. So we really aren't making any money doing research, right?
Yeah, so my question is on that actual, does that take into consideration the cap, the administrative cap on that, or does that include all the administrative costs in that one?
Includes all the administrative costs in there, so it's uncapped. We're not all that far over the cap for organized research. So I think we were, I don't know if I have a slide in here. I think we were maybe 27 or something over the rate. So much of that's just a product of the negotiation process and what they're willing to do and what they felt like their bosses would sign off on, and what our standing is inside of the region that we're in, and those kinds of things. So like the East Coast schools, the big schools, tend to have bigger rates because they have bigger O&M, right? It's cold out there, although it's cold here as well. But for comparison, let's say I spent the first 15 or so years of my career in the defense industry, working for McDonnell Douglas making airplanes. And, we had 4 different indirect cost rates, the equivalent of indirect cost rates. So there's an engineering one, there's a product support one, there's a manufacturing one, and an engineering one, they were all well over 100%. So like the engineering rate was in the 300s that got reimbursed as part of that. So it kind of makes me angry that, they're going to unilaterally impose a 15% rate on us when we're already in the hole. But there's no talk of, hey, Lockheed Martin, Ball Aerospace, some of these places have huge indirect cost rates so that they're not under attack.
Well, it's also true, isn't it, Doug, that at industry and business partners, they don't have the cap on the administrative side. So it's only for institutes of higher education that were capped at the 26%. So, but we also have, from what I've been reading, and again, I'm not terribly knowledgeable about this, but I've also been reading that there's a lot of the DOE labs that are also well over the 100%. Chris is asking about the concept of over greater than 100%. How is that reimbursement then not profit?
Well, I mean, it's a fraction. So if the base is small enough and the overhead expenses are large enough, you get a rate that's over 100%. Sometimes they don't necessarily have an MTDC kind of base relationship. Sometimes it's just salaries and wages over the direct expense. it's just a math, it's an allocation problem, right? It's like what's the fairest way to allocate indirect expenses? For a long time there was a big push for activity-based costing, right? Activities consume resources, and that's a whole different way to look at it than just saying, hey, we're going to take a pool and we're going to divide it by this, and we're going to have a fraction, and we're going to allocate it. We're going to make activity-based costing, make some effort to understand how those indirect activities are consumed and by what activities they're consumed. So you would allocate things based on the number of purchase orders issued, right? You would allocate the purchasing expense over the number of purchase orders issued, so that if you consumed more of the purchasing activity, you would pay more for the purchasing activity, rather than saying, hey, we're just going to evenly allocate the cost of purchasing over everybody. But that too would take a lot of full employment by consultants to come in and help us do that.
So there's a question about our indirect cost rate, and is it about our rate being lower than a lot of others? Is that because we fundamentally do things differently in Colorado, or that things are cheaper?
Not things that are cheaper, but a lot of places have a lot more space. So they have a lot more buildings. They have a lot more building depreciation. They have a lot more things going on, a lot more expensive new buildings going on. We don't build a ton of buildings here, right? We're not constantly building research facilities, which are expensive. WashU had a waiting list of donors who had money in hand enough to get their name on a building. They just didn't have enough space to build the building. It wasn't so they were constantly renovating space, building buildings for research. All those things end up in that uncapped facilities pool, right? Building depreciation and depreciation of expensive research, state-of-the-art research buildings. And O&M, right? I mean, like I said, Boston's really cold in the winter, and so it takes a lot of fuel oil to heat buildings, and they tend to have a bigger rate than, say, even like West Coast schools.
I love your analysis that their rates are high because it's colder.
Okay, I thought I'd talk just a little bit about how we internally treat the reimbursement for indirect costs, and one of the topics is the RSSI, or the Research and Scholarly Success Initiative, where we take some of the indirect cost return. It's supposed to reimburse us for expenses that are incurred, and we use them as reinvestment funds for the research enterprise, and to help the research enterprise grow. It's modeled, the Research and Scholarly Success Initiative, RSSI, is modeled after the Student Success Initiative that preceded it. So we said, hey, we're gonna negotiate a new rate. The last time we negotiated a new rate, the rate at the end of the previous agreement was 48.7, and the VPR at the time negotiated with the provost that, hey, when we negotiate a higher rate, let's take the difference between what we ended up with and then the new higher rates, and reserve that reimbursement, and use it strategically to invest in the research enterprise. So that's a great thing for the research enterprise, right? We get to use it for cost shares and investment in equipment and facilities and those kinds of things. The downside is that the federal negotiators and the Congress people and see that, and they say, well, you treat that as, not reimbursement for expense, but you're using it for all kinds of other things than reimbursement of the expense. And so it tends to weaken our argument a little bit, although, the counter argument is we've already paid that expense, and it's already come out of the general fund, and that kind of thing. So the RSSI was designed to, like I said, model after the Student Success Initiative, which was very successful in helping us grow the student population. And so this is on the left is how when we get an indirect cost reimbursement, here's how we redistribute that money back into the university. So 51% of any indirect cost recoveries that we get go back to the university, go back to central office, to Angie, to help pay for all the things that we talked about that are in that pool, right? The general administration, the buildings, the O&M, the maintenance, all that stuff. 35.25 of that goes back to colleges to help. They can do with it, obviously do what they want, but the idea is to help cover the cost. Like we talked about, the college and department administration is a big chunk of the F&A expense, so it goes back. The VPR keeps some of it. The research building revolving fund keeps some of it to help fund capital leases and capital improvements to buildings. The cores get a little piece of it. The PRSE gets a little piece of it, and the provost gets a little piece of it in order to support programs and things there. And then after RSSI, you can see that RSSI gets about 4% of that now, and it kind of readjusts all the other allocations. So, this allocation back to these entities inside the university of the indirect cost recovery happened before me, so more than 15 years ago, and I think it was Tony Frank, when Tony Frank was the VPR, Chancellor Frank. I think that was the last time this sort of allocation of the indirect cost recoveries was talked about or negotiated. It's fairly generous. I mean, I worked at two institutions where at St. Louis U, the CFO would just come to me after I negotiated it and say, I need $3 million out of the indirect cost recovery to cover everything. And so that, before I could redistribute any of it back to anybody, I had to give him a big chunk of it. And that left often, I was giving researchers or colleges back, $200 at the end, at the end of it, based on the fact that, we didn't earn that much in indirect cost recoveries. WashU had a proration process where the costs of the central offices were charged out to the colleges, and so they got to keep the indirect cost recoveries, but then they ended up paying for the services, almost kind of like an activity-based costing approach of, here's the bill for sponsored programs, here's the bill for purchasing, here's the bill, here's your share of that expense. So there are a variety of ways to do it, and a variety of ways of percentages and how they go back into pools that colleges and universities can use to redistribute those funds. This kind of redistribution, these are unrestricted funds when they come here. I mean, it's cost reimbursement, so there aren't any rules around what it has to go back to do or where it has to be distributed. So colleges and universities are free to do whatever it is they want to do with those funds. I think there was a question, Shannon.
Yep, there is. Is RSSI only applied to projects that are on campus? And does it matter if it is research or other sponsored activities? I think the question is more like, do we take this RSSI, how do we deal with indirect costs as a whole? I mean, do we lump all of it together and then take the RSSI on all of it, or is it only on a specific type?
Yeah, it's only for on-campus organized research projects. So the same projects that would have received the 48.7% rate, where that's the appropriate rate for them at the time, then the new calculation would only apply to those. So on-campus organized research projects, because the 26 is capped, so the off-campus and the other ones are less. There's less going on there.
And I think it's also important because I think a lot of times people just don't understand where the money comes from or how things are paid out. But every college, the reimbursement that comes back to the college, the cost reimbursement that comes back to even every college, they then decide how to use that money. And it's different at every college. So,
right.
So Doug can't really talk about how it works at your college, but if you have questions, you might ask your departmental or your college business officers.
Yep.
Allison, do you have a question or a comment?
Did I say something wrong, Allison? Did I say something
No,
wrong?
you didn't say anything wrong, but because everybody will come to me with questions, just know that the blue triangle is a good solid estimate, but it really depends on if your research is on campus or not.
Right.
So it depends on if you get charged a lot of RSSI or not. So you can't just take those numbers and say, okay, this is how much we're going to get, because the calculation is more difficult than that. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah. It has to do with indirect costs, so it's complicated, right?
Yes.
There's another question, and it says, why has the ICR, so we know indirect cost rate on 22 accounts stayed the same when indirect costs for 5.3 accounts have increased over time?
Don't get me started on that topic. Yeah.
We've got
I
a little
think,
time, Doug. You can get
yeah.
started. Just
A different process was used to establish, as I understand it, right? As this stuff all happened before Doug arrived on the scene. I understand that the process and was different for establishing those rates for 22 accounts, because they were, I think, designed to recover some administrative expense of performing services for the public. Now, the cost accountant in me says, hey, if we're doing research kinds of services that use research facilities, then we should be charging research rates, right? I mean, the idea is to fairly recover the cost of providing that service. So, if I'm doing something that I'm doing it out of research space, and I'm using research equipment and consuming research level of utilities, et cetera, that the rate should be higher. And I think there's some traction towards sort of relooking at how things end up in 22 accounts and making it easier and more productive to have them go through 5.3 accounts and get a more appropriate indirect cost rate assigned to them. But I think everybody's been busy because of the craziness that comes out of Washington on the regular, at least every Friday afternoon, right? So I'm not sure where, but yeah, the rate there should move with respect to the cost. It should be related to costs and actual costs incurred and the kind of thing, the kind of structured process that we go through, for instance, for the indirect cost rates that are used in organized research and other sponsored activities. That's all I'll say before I get in trouble. Since we're recording this.
since we're recording. Yes.
But that's a good question.
Oh, there we go. We have another question. Where does the ICR go for the 22? How do you know how that's distributed?
I do not. That's a kind of a business and finance kind of thing since they run the 22 accounts. Not sure how if there's some kind of share that happens there. Does anybody at the college level know?
I can say that for my 22 that I used to manage, we did not used to get back any of the what was recovered.
So it was all kind of a scoop by Central to cover the cost of.
Yep. Just a clarifying, 22s are handled by VPUO.
Okay, business and finance, VPUO, yeah. Vice President of University Operations.
Thank you. Thank you. If cost recoveries are for actual costs, but not all of it goes back to paying those costs, how do we pay for those costs?
13 funds, tuition, I mean, the university has limited sources of income, right? So if we under recover on indirect costs, or if we waive indirect costs, or if we charge our industry partners less than our actual expenses, then that money has to come from somewhere, right? It has to come from 13 funds that get allocated to us by the state, which are less and less all the time, or tuition. And as my provost at St. Louis U used to always tell me, not on the backs of the undergraduates. You researchers have to cover your own expenses. Yeah, it's important that we, to the extent possible, that we recover as much indirect cost as we can to field back into the pool. I think in March, I think our effective rate is around 28%, as compared to the 54%, which is the stated rate that we should recover. And even at 54, as you've seen, because of the cap pools, that doesn't necessarily recover all our costs, and the things that get weeded out as a result of the negotiation process. We're kind of in the hole on all of that. So did I answer the question, or did I get lost there at the end? I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, and I think that that's why everyone is in such a panic about these capped 15% indirect cost rates that are coming down, is because we're already not recovering um, the full cost of research, and universities are already, and it's not a good term to be using, but we're already cost sharing into every single research project that, and not just research, sponsored award that we get into the university. So that's why everyone's in such a panic about this. So, but
It
we
would
do
it would
have,
it would
oh,
severely impact our ability to do those things, right? Because you know the chat GPT that they're using to write these executive orders doesn't consider like the whole ecosystem of you can't just say, okay, I'm going to limit your recovery to 15%. Okay, does that mean that the cost accounting standards go out the window, that we are no longer bound by all those restrictions of what can be direct charged and what has to be part of the indirect cost pool? Are there going to be is there going to be relief granted for all the administrative things that we have to do, all the compliance issues that we have, the animal care requirements, the human subjects requirements, all the things that administrators are doing that directly impact the conduct of research. Are we all of a sudden going to be out from under all of that? I don't think so, but I don't think they've thought that through. I think they just see the idea of, so I'm just going to cut a bunch of cost out, and this is a way to do it. And I'm going to hang my hat on the idea that, well, you guys will take, you'll take 10% from Bill Gates, or, the American Lung Association, American Heart Association, nonprofits, you'll take a much lower rate. But there's a cost accounting argument for that too, right? Is that, as long as you're covering your marginal expenses, you're going to do that, right? We're going to cover that graduate student. We're going to cover some of that salary time to move the process forward of the research project or the research enterprise or that topic. And so we'll try to recover as much as we can, but there's also it's a complicated argument. There are lots of things there, and the federal government has historically sort of supported the idea that they want to support basic research and the basic understanding of things and the way that we improve the life and health and liberty of the citizens of the country. And part of that is to support, the necessary infrastructure to do that. Okay. No more politics.
Could the entire structure of determining direct costs change? Something
I
like
mean,
every type of current indirect cost would be reviewed and alternate models of charging these expenses directly could be developed?
I think that's that's a great idea, and that's a logical idea, but I don't think logic applies much here. I think uh, I mean, right now things are under, and I've spent a lot of my Sunday afternoons calculating the impact of these for attorneys, the attorney general, to get temporary restraining orders to stop the federal government from doing this capriciously. And lots of the arguments are that they haven't followed their own administrative rules. The NIH has a couple of wrinkles in there in terms of their enacting legislation, has language in it that says you can't monkey with the indirect cost rate. The indirect cost rate's the negotiated rate, and don't monkey with it. So they've run afoul of many of those things, which is why everything is being held up in court to be decided how to do that. But I mean, if you really want to take the complexity out of this, then yeah, you look at a different model, or you would look at different ways to calculate the indirect costs and decide sort of what the philosophy is of the federal government around what they want to support. Right now when we calculate the rate, that's the rate that everyone should pay, right? That's the rate regardless of whether they're federal government or they're Bill Gates Foundation. 54% is the cost of supporting organized research here. So because they're willing to pay their fair share doesn't mean they're being overcharged, right? Because if they were being overcharged, then we would calculate a rate just for them, which would be, which we would load up and say, well, you're going to pay for everything, and everybody's not going to pay for something else. the rules that we have in place now, the cost accounting standards, they are in place to make sure that the government is paying its fair share of the indirect cost expenses. They're not being overcharged. It's their fair share. It's that we're willing to accept a lower rate from other institutions, other sponsors, that has sort of caused some of this furor, or is just a crack in the system that allows the federal government to sort of exploit that right now. So it would be nice to look at an activity-based costing approach to reimbursement, or something that is more academically sound than the thing we're doing now. But I doubt that that's on the horizon right now.
So Doug, I didn't talk to you about this, and I'm going to ask a scenario, and it's kind of a devil's advocate scenario. Let's say I'm a researcher or a PI, and let's say I'm in liberal arts. And this kind of goes to the last question. My research doesn't use a lot of these things that you're talking about that we fund. I don't do animal research. I don't do human subjects research. I don't have any biosafety. I'm very simple, and it's just me and, et cetera. Why do I have to pay the full indirect cost rate on my research or on my sponsored project?
Because of the approach, right? The approach is hey, we're going to put all of these costs into this pool, and we're going to allocate it across all the direct expenses. So if you're a liberal arts researcher, you're probably not getting paid. You're not paying the organized research rate. Maybe you're doing other sponsored activities, and so you're getting a lower rate to begin with that doesn't reflect extreme utilities use or O&M, that kind of thing. That's what I was talking about. Sorry. Having a different academic approach to the allocation of costs. So an activity-based scenario would be if I place a purchase order, I get charged for the cost of placing a purchase order. If I get a paycheck, I get charged for the cost of the paycheck, right? I have to pay for what indirect activities I consume. That's a much more difficult model to create and to maintain. The use of a fraction and to say, hey, we're going to allocate all those expenses based on the function and just allocate them evenly to everybody. Yeah, I hate to say that there are some winners and some losers, but right. I mean, it's everybody contributes to all of that across the board. They attempt to get a little bit of that leveling the field by the functions, right? So if it's other sponsored activities, it has a lower rate. If it's organized research, it has a higher rate of allocation. I don't know if that. I mean, businesses face this kind of thing too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I overpricing a good because I'm just allocating all the indirect cost expense of the factory to all of the products evenly, even though some of the products maybe don't consume resources at that level. So that's the Harvard Business School sort of started to look into that activity-based costing kind of stuff.
No, and again, it was devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I do understand that the way that we do it is a lot more, I don't want to say simplistic, because this is not simple in any way, shape, or form, but the other things are way more convoluted, or if we had to start putting direct charges for everything that we did, would be really difficult to do.
It would be. Nobody's
Doug,
ready to scrub accounts and do the step down schedule. Darn.
I think everyone else is like, what? Huh?
You really do learn a lot about the operations of a university when you do an indirect cost proposal. It's really pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But then again, I am an accountant, so
you like these kind of things?
Yeah, it's kind of fun, actually.
Thank you for attending.